Okay, good morning, everyone. We're so honored to have you all here today. Thank you for coming to our CLAA Artist Summit and Workshop, Cultivating Compassion for Migrants Through Fine Arts and Prose. This is going to be a 2-day event of workshops and lectures and roundtables that are going to address developing a community sense of place for young artists and writers in the Rio Grande Valley. My name is Dr. Catherine Moore McAllen. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American Arts, and I'm honored to have these panelists here today in person and via Zoom. Luis Urrea is present via Zoom from Chicago, and we are all here in the panel here at the Center for Latin American Arts in Edinburgh, Texas. So thank you, Luis, for joining us. We're gonna try to coordinate this elegantly and successfully, so please bear with us as we make sure to include as many people as possible. So we're excited to have this opportunity to share ideas and address issues related to immigration, to share experiences about the border through the lens of art. Art meaning fine arts, writing, and any other media in the arts. And we're extremely honored to have a group of writers and artists joining us in this 2-day collaboration. This event today, the Writers Workshop, is co-sponsored by the Center for Mexican American Studies here at UTRGV. And all of this is happening at the same time and in conjunction with the Hostile Terrain 94 exhibition, which is installed downstairs in the UTRGV library in Edinburgh and also at the Rustenburg Gallery in Brownsville, on our Brownsville campus of UTRGV. So we're excited to continue the discourses related to identity, immigration, and compassion for migrants, and how this can be expressed through the lens of art. And this morning, we are going to have our Writers Roundtable. And the title of our Writers Roundtable is called Crafting Your Writer's Process, El Primer Paso. And we're calling it El Primer Paso because we hope this is just the beginning of many dialogues and hopefully future publications and collaborations with our colleagues here in the Rio Grande Valley and nationally and internationally. We are very honored today to have author, poet, and Pulitzer Prize finalist Luis Urrea. He's going to join us via Zoom, along with 4 writers of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry who are sitting here with me at the panel today at the center to discuss the different aspects of the writer's craft, including what inspires their writing process, and what it's like to work in the genre. And we're going to consider how immigration and the border have shaped the lives of these writers, of the participants in this room today, and those joining us via Zoom. We want to examine how our work and our identity and writing and the process of being creative allows us to share our experiences and also discuss the approach to creating art and creating writing. So we also wanted to mention that today we want to encourage your feedback and your participation even after this event ends. Audience engagement is really important to us, and we're excited to work with you. And our panelists are going to craft a prompt throughout this workshop today and share it with the participants at the end of the day. And we wanted to encourage all audiences to write a poem or a text up to 500 words in response to the prompt we discussed today later. And we wanted to provide you opportunities to post your work in a forum that is connected to the Center for Latin American Arts, so the ideas can continue even after this panel ends. And we are planning for our participants, our panelists here today, to provide feedback through later posts, so this can create an ongoing conversation that can continue and give you time to think and really dive into what we're talking about and process it as well. So our participating panelists today are Luis Alberto Urrea, who is going to join us first via Zoom, We also have Cecilia Ballí to my right, a journalist, writer, and anthropologist. We have Melissa Guerra to her right, food historian, writer, and an MFA graduate of UTRGV's creative writing program. And to her right, we have Christopher Carmona, a UTRGV faculty member and interim director of Mexican American Studies, and also a writer and author. And then we have to his right, César L de León, a poet, writer, and also UTRGV faculty member and community activist and inspiring writer as well. So we have this group together, and we're going to start by each writer is going to spend about 5 or 10 minutes talking about their process. And so we will begin with Luis Urrea. And just to give you a little background on Luis, I think he needs no introduction, but Luis Alberto Urrea is a Guggenheim Fellow and a Pulitzer Prize finalist, as I mentioned. He's the author of 18 books, the winner of numerous awards for his poetry, fiction, and essays. He was born in Tijuana to a Mexican father and American mother, and Urrea is most recognized as a border writer. Through his essays, he writes, "I am more interested in bridges, not borders." The Devil's Highway, Urrea's 2004 nonfiction account of a group of Mexican immigrants lost in the Arizona desert, won the Lannan Literary Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the Pacific Rim Kiriyama Prize. His latest novel, The House of Broken Angels, was a 2018 finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. He won an American Academy of Arts and Letters Fiction Award for his collection of short stories, The Water Museum, which was a finalist for the Penn Faulkner Award. Urrea's novel, Into the Beautiful North, is a big red selection of the National Endowment of the Arts. He is a distinguished professor of creative writing at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where he was recently inducted into the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame. So we're excited to welcome Luis today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Pues buenos días, Texas. Tijuana in the house. Oye, 5 minutes to talk about process. Oh, Lord, there's so much to talk about. I would say to you, don't ever forget who you represent, who you are, where you're from. Because even if you don't do it, the culture will remind you. Para mí, it's all about family. It's all about the ghosts. Much of my family is gone. It's all about being from a culture that was not valued in San Diego. I didn't know this. Everybody I knew and loved, except my mom, mira la cara, my mom was from New York, though the Güeros are the Urreas. My grandmother was named Guadalupe Murray. So we were actually sort of Irish, Basque Mexicanos. Plus my mom, now I look Irish. What can I do? But I learned to speak Spanish first. I learned to read in English, to set a kind of a course without me knowing it. And everybody I loved, everybody I revered, everybody I cared about, everybody I worshiped, everybody I listened to and learned from, Mexicanos, did not speak English at all. And when we crossed the border, I found out Southern California did not love us. I thought, what? I started hearing all that racist stuff I'm sure you hear, and I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to understand that. And I got, I think, kind of truculent. I wanted to represent. And so, you know, I began early. I began wanting to be a writer in high school. And I have had the same practice since I was about 16. And that is notebooks. I always have a notebook with me. I was the guy in high school. I didn't have a cent, didn't have nice clothes, didn't have good shoes, never going to get a car, was a bad dancer, but I had poems. And these are the ones I use now because they fit in my pockets. I can take them everywhere. Upstairs, if you went into my writing room, you'd find 300 or more notebooks. Not much of it worth publishing, but it's homework, it's practice. I just want to say about the immigration issue, because there's so much, these people at the table are so brilliant. I don't want to take up more than my allotted time, but just to give you an idea, I want you to understand something, that if you stick with it, if you carry your cultura, your ancestors, your cultural pride with you, and people will try to make you be quiet, people will hope that you go away, you keep coming back. Pardon me for some bad language here, but my rule number one, if you were to take a workshop with me, I would tell you, rule number one is to wear the bastards down. There's people who will tell you no, ignore them and keep going. Yes. And then one day you wake up and you're kind of in industry. I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened. And one of the reasons I'm not with you is, of course, I'm teaching here in Chicago, but I'm also working on some movie stuff on Zoom. Everything's on Zoom except my class. Now helping a guy writing an opera about, guess what? Immigration. So things happen and you have to be ready for it. I want to just spend at least a minute or two just telling you about the Devil's Highway, which was my breakthrough book, a nonfiction book about death on the border. I had written almost everything that I had done. Oh, hey, hi.
Sorry.
Hi. I was looking at the panel.
Well, Louis, I think if we have to project you on the screen, you have to hold on just 1 second, okay? Hold on 1 second. Do you want me to mute it? Okay, hold on. I'm sorry, Luis, hold on. Okay, never mind. Just continue. Sorry. Go ahead.
So I had written a lot of books about the border, my family experience, honoring my ancestors. This may sound funny to you, but this is honestly true. You know what I really always wanted to honor? The women in the tortilleria. We didn't have, I'm old, man. We didn't have machines. We didn't have tortilla presses. We did it, the real style, just like the Aztecs did, Tlaxcaltines doing that. And I always tell young people when I see you, if you think about it, what's so special about this is that every pat repeated hundreds of millions of times was a prayer for your future. Those ancestors all were praying for you when they were making tortillas. And I've always thought about those women that made those. I never saw men making them. And they were always my heroes in what I was trying to write. So the Devil's Highway tragedy happened. 14 men died on the border, lost, abandoned by their coyote, and in Arizona, southern Arizona. And Little Brown, the big publisher in New York, called me, the oldest publisher in America. I was publishing books, with Cinco Puntos Press in El Paso, Ben Signs, if you know Benjamin Signs. We started out at the same time. So we've been racing each other our entire careers. He's beating me right now, but I'll get him. But they called and said, do you want to write this book? And I said, I don't really want to write it. They said, why not? I said, I've written all these books about the border and I feel too responsible for all those lives. And I was also scared of the Border Patrol, but I wasn't going to tell them that. And the editors asked me one question. And I will give that question to you, and then I'll step back to hear our esteemed panel talk. But the editor said, do you trust anybody else to write this book? And I said, no. I said, that's your answer, then. And I'm glad I did, because it changed my life. It changed my career. And it's, it's in 30 editions. It just won't die. I don't know what happened in that book, but I'm very thankful it did. And the weirdest thing is, even though we're opposed in so many ways, the Border Patrol taught it in the Border Patrol Academy. so the agents could understand a little bit more about the migrant in the desert. So, you know, wear them down, keep going. What you're carrying in you, if you are, and you probably are, is sacred. It's special. It's the most important thing we have to give, which is story. So I'll be quiet and listen. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Cecilia Ballí. Cecilia is joining us today from Houston. She is a daughter of the Rio Grande Valley and was born here, but she works in Houston as a magazine journalist and a cultural anthropologist who has written about the US-Mexico border and Latinos in Texas for more than 20 years. She is the founder and principal of Culture Concepts, a strategic and creative consultancy that provides ethnographic research, cultural analysis, storytelling, and strategic messaging. Ballí is also a writer at large for Texas Monthly and has written for various other publications, including Harper's Magazine, Columbia Journalism Review, and the New York Times. As an anthropologist, Cecilia was a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and she has conducted research on Tejano identity and culture and the sexual killing of women in Ciudad Juarez, the US-Mexico border wall, and Latino voter participation. She has won various journalism awards, and her writing has appeared in multiple anthologies, including Hecho en Texas, an anthology of Texas Mexican literature and best American crime writing. Okay, all right. She's telling me to stop. It's a big room to. All right, she also holds a bachelor's degree from Stanford and a PhD in anthropology from Rice, go Owls. And she is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Houston Center for Mexican American Studies. We are honored and very thankful to have Cecilia here today.
I just emailed my bio and I'm like, that's too long. That's enough. We know enough. I want to start by saying I'm so excited. My heart explodes every time I'm back in the Valley, even though I do it fairly often. But being from here, when I'm back down, my heart just feels really full. And I'm nostalgic being on this campus because when I used to come here, it was for the All Valley Band concerts when I was a high school, very devoted high school clarinet player. And that was like the one time that we ventured onto the big university campus in the Valley. And it was so exciting. So to be here talking about the border and immigration is something that would have never happened back then. I grew up in Brownsville in the 80s and early 90s. I'm dating myself. And these are issues that were not discussed, even though they were playing out very much in our day-to-day lives, right? So I am from parents who grew up in Matamoros, outside of Matamoros, on ranchitos out there. They both come from families that have been in the border region for hundreds of years. So we're very rooted in this place, but I grew up very much with Norteño, Tamaulipas identity and speaking Spanish and listening to accordion music. And at the time, one of the things I consider a big gift of growing up in the Valley is that we were surrounded by people like us and by our culture. And that's very nurturing. A lot of young Latino kids throughout the country don't have that, and it's a very different experience. But at the same time, we always got messages, at least back then, that our culture wasn't as good and that we all should strive to speak English only, and that what we needed to do was become these other kinds of Americans who went off and did other kinds of things, right? And so I would hide the fact I didn't want my dad to bring me my lunch because he wore a cowboy hat. And, I did talk about that we watched Televisa at home, not MTV. And these are different times in the Valley, and I'm really happy about that. I still think we have a way to go. But it's a really important thing to begin with being able to own who you are and where you come from and write from there, and develop, or even if you don't write, develop a sense of your voice, what you have to say and what you have to contribute to the world based on where you come from, who you are, what shaped you, right? So for me, I had to go out to college in California, and I started, the first time I realized that I liked to write or tell stories, I started writing these little nonfiction stories from my memories of growing up here. I had one called Las Bodas de la 82. The ranch where my dad grew up was called, it had a formal name, but we called it La 82 because it was on the Derecha 82 on a road. And, you know, it was these massive parties where like the women changed dresses 3 times, you know, throughout the day and the night and the next morning. And you eat multiple times, and there's a big truck full of Coca-Colas and cervezas, and you can drink all you want, and there's no bathrooms, but you just pee in your dress if you're a little girl. And you listen to Carlos Jose, and the couples just dance and dance and dance, and no one pays attention to the kids all night, so it's a huge adventure. So I started writing these little stories, you know, and it was like because I was far away from home, and I was looking at it from a distance, and I was maybe nostalgic, a little homesick. But it was like, that's where like my impulse to tell stories began. Later I started, I'm fast forwarding now very quickly to keep this short, but I had the opportunity to become a writer for Texas Monthly magazine when I was 24. And that magazine, in more than 30 years of existence, had never had a writer who was not white, a writer who was Latino or Black. And, you know, they'd written about the border. They'd written about Latinos occasionally. The border was more interesting because it was kind of exotic and dangerous and wacky in their eyes. And I realized, you know, we're not telling our own stories. It's not, even in our own state of Texas, it's not people from the border who are writing about what the border is or writing about who Latinos are. It was always through this other lens and angle. And we always looked a little distorted through that angle, through that lens. We always looked a little funny. And so that became my thing. I devoted the past 20 years to writing for them. I never took a full-time job there that's for another panel to talk about race, politics, and media. But, you know, I developed this other simultaneous line of work as an ethnographer, where I'm really trying to understand the culture and the life of the society of this region. Ultimately, I ended up writing a lot about the killing of women in Ciudad Juárez. But you know, I'm still now I'm trying to move more to some national publications and think about, you know, what is the story of Latinos that's not the stories that are not getting told at a national level. Now that the nation is finally paying attention to this region. I used to pitch stories from here. You know, I was connected many years ago when I was in my 20s with editors in New York. And I would pitch stories from down here, and they were like, those are regional stories. Those are not national stories. Now it's flooded here, right? With national and international media. But they send their own people. They don't call on us. Right? Yeah. So there's ongoing issues and problems, but that compels me to keep writing, even though it's hard financially. I have to have another job to support my vicio of writing. But it's that sense of once you discover that you have something to say, it's really hard to turn your back on it. And sometimes I tell my sisters, oh man, I wish I didn't know what my passion was. You know, then I could do some kind of more profitable work and be at peace mentally with myself and life and everything. That's not true, right? But you know, once you find that voice and that story, that turns into another story and into another story, and it becomes a string of stories that you tell throughout your life that add up to something. There's usually some bigger themes there. And I just want to say, I love what Luis said about, you know, sort of the story is the greatest gift you have to give, and it's sacred. Don't take that lightly. At first, I was a journalist. When I first moved into the space of creative writers and fiction writers, they would talk about how the story was bigger than you and all this stuff. And I was like, that's kind of silly and lofty. You know, I was very factual, very on the ground. And no, it is bigger than you. I've discovered in the process. It's something magical. It really is. You are not just writing about yourself and what you saw. You are tapping into something much bigger that touches many people, that has played out over many years. You are writing for a community. You are writing to a history that hasn't been told. You're a part of something much bigger every time you do that, even if you just write it for yourself at home. That's the thing. That's where it begins, is that you connect to something much bigger and much more important than just your own life, you know? Just to close, like Luis is, when people ask me who are your top writers, and Luis is always one of the top 2 that I mention. It's a huge privilege for us to have him with us this weekend. That's not an understatement, you know, and I think it's very special. We're all here from the Valley, it turns out. So that's also very special to get to have this dialogue. And then we have the godfather, Luis, who is from the other end of the border. El Padrino. I will forgive him for being from the western part of the border. Everybody always says that the border runs west to east. I correct people. It runs east to west. You know why? Because historically, when it was marked, when the International Boundary Commission that literally went around engineers and marked the ground and marked the border, they started at the Boca Chica beach. And then they ended in Tijuana. So, but Luis has been an inspiration because he works across genres, and because like today, you know, I wrote everything he said down. He keeps reminding us why we're doing what we're doing. So anyway, that's my hopefully 10-minute intro, and I'll pass it on to my good friend, Melissa.
Thank you, Cecilia. So our next writer is Melissa Guerra. Melissa is an 8th-generation Texan, born and raised on a working cattle ranch here in the Rio Grande Valley in South Texas. She's a self-taught culinary expert, a food historian, and I want to add here, an amazing chef, specializing in the foodways of the American continent, especially Texas, regional, Mexican, and Latin American cuisine. Her second book, Dishes from the Wild Horse Desert, Norteño Cuisine of South Texas, was a finalist for the James Beard Award in the category of Food of the Americas, and for an International Association of Culinary Professionals Award. The Texas Provincial Kitchen book was her first cookbook, and it was self-published. After acquiring her MFA in creative writing at UT Rio Grande Valley, Guerra continues to write and publish articles about life along the United States-Mexican border. As an active food blogger, you can also follow Melissa Guerra daily through her Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter posts, and her website, kitchenwrangler.com. Melissa is a member of Les Dames d'Escoffier. Okay. All right. Okay, moving on. She also teaches at the Culinary Institute of America with students in New York, San Antonio, Hyde Park, and Guerra also works as a freelance recipe developer. So her past projects have included her a cooking show, Texas Provincial Kitchen, and also she's worked as a bilingual spokesperson for Kraft, Goya, Mazola, and she served as a consultant and was featured as a culinary expert on the PBS reality show, Texas Ranch House. So join me in welcoming Melissa Guerra.
To reiterate what Cecilia was saying, it's such an incredible privilege and honor to be here with Luis Urrea, with his panel of distinguished writers from the Rio Grande Valley, and it's just really humbling to be here. So I hope I say something smart. So hang in there. I can do my best. So yeah, I grew up on a ranch in San Manuel, and I went to Catholic school here in Edinburgh, Texas, just about a mile down the road. And, you know, I never really knew where I fit in. I come from a family that's really into history, but I never really felt like a part of it, because it was usually the history of men doing one thing, and then that rewrote history. And you're like, well, what happens then during the other 23 and a half hours during the day? Like, what, isn't that historical? And I don't think it really started out as like a rebellion or this rebellious thought. It's just, I really like to eat. I really, you know, while everybody was talking about history, I was usually staring at my plate, you know, picking at it, or, you know, looking at it. And so I really wanted to know about this domestic history that nobody ever spoke about. You know, what were the women doing? What were the women wearing? What did they do all day? How are the kids being raised? What was the wisdom? And it always seemed to revolve around the kitchen, the room of water and fire, and where things actually happen. I mean, you think that the excitement's in the bedroom, and it really isn't. It's in the kitchen. Like, everything happens there, all of the drama. And so I started looking at food history really seriously, you know, because if you start looking at, like, say we go out to a restaurant, you know, like we went out yesterday, I ordered an enchilada plate, and you start dissecting the enchilada plate, what actually on that is native. You know, cheese comes from cows, Boston, because, you know, they they come from the African continent, they come from the Asia, they come from, so they're not of the Americas, that's my point. Onions, those are, I think, from around the Fertile Crescent, somewhere around Egypt. You know, so you have all these different cultures that culminate on a plate. And one of the things that I've gotten to learn from being a teacher at the Culinary Institute of America and lecturing on food history is that, you know, some of my students would be from Puerto Rico, or they would be from or New York, but they had no idea that bananas weren't native to Hispaniola. So they didn't really understand that you had to take the ingredients way back to where the ingredients were from. And once you started looking at ingredients, it told me of this incredible history where I did fit in. There weren't any really great days of battle or decrees that were signed or these one-time events. It was this fabric of centuries of trade, of incorporating these different plants and animals into your daily life. And it was this really, really beautiful story that I could be a part of, and that I could narrate to other people that maybe didn't feel like that they had any heroism in their past or potential heroism in their future. You know, you could be an everyday hero and living this food story every day. So the way that I always explain food history to people is free, flourished, and favored, and it actually illustrates colonization in a way, because, you know, when you look at any cuisine, like I'm always very focused on coming up with something authentic. What is authentic? Who should be here? What should be here? And the first thing is whatever's free, whatever's in the ambiente, whatever, you know, whatever the yeasts that are in the air, the climate, the native animals. You know, the Americas only has 2 domesticated animals, which is it was the guanaco and the vicuña, which are of Peru. And then that became the llama and the alpaca, which were later domesticated. So anything you look at in terms of food, pork, chicken, cattle, any of that came from the New World. So, you know, you start, when you start looking at our local border cuisine, which that's my jam, you know, you start realizing that so very little of it is actually native. If you only have, I mean, if we're talking about carne asada, Luis, we were inviting you to a carne asada, you know, but mostly I know, it's there. The invitation is open para siempre, para que sepas. But mostly what you would be served would be the food of the colonies, of the colonization, because it's no longer, we've gotten away from what is free, which would, if we were going to have a free carne asada, it would be whitetail and rabbit. But if you show up, we'll probably have fajitas, which would be, in my opinion, is the second layer of authenticity, which is flourished. It's something that was brought in from elsewhere and it flourishes here. Cattle does really well in the valley. Citrus, I always thought citrus was native. It's not, but it flourishes. Just like the bananas across Hispaniola, which my students didn't quite understand. The third layer is favor. We cannot have a meal anywhere without coffee and tea. Can we grow it? No. We cannot. We have to bring it from elsewhere. It's something we like. I like tea with lemon. Neither one of them are of the valley, but you cannot go to Whataburger without getting an iced tea. So I learned a lot. Studying food was a great way for me to study about humanity without studying war and without studying the history of men. Sorry, guys, I love you, but I really wanted to know what was being done on a daily basis. What kept, oh gosh, this is a terrible way to say it. What kept people going to war? It's a terrible way to say it, but there had to have been something that happened in the daily life that kept people going and continuing and pushing forward every day. And regardless of socioeconomic levels, even though that does affect food, you know, food was always there. It was always what, you know, people had dinner, went to bed, got up the next day, went and achieved something, you know, but then they always came back home. So it's really been a satisfying journey to continue to study about food. It's like I said, it was a study in my own identity. and it helped me figure out where I fit in. And it's something that I'm going to study for the rest of my life, and hopefully somebody will read it. I don't know. But and I brought for the students that are here today, this is specifically for the students. I brought 3 of my first cookbooks, and we're going to pick 3 names randomly, 3 free cookbooks. You know, so you can see my first project. Holy cow! From 1997. But yeah, I am writing, and I've modernized. I now blog. My grandmother always said that she started cooking at the ranch using wood. She ended up using a microwave. You know, things progress in life. But anyway, super grateful to be here. Just a privilege. And look at your food. It tells you a lot.
Thank you. Our next panelist, thank you, Melissa. Our next panelist is Christopher Carmona, one of our UTRGV faculty members who is based out of Brownsville. Christopher is also an author. He is the author of The Road to Llorona Park, which won the 2016 NACCS Tejas Best Fiction Award and was listed as one of the top 8 Latinx books in 2016 by NBC News. He has 3 books of poetry, 140 Twitter poems, I've Always Been Here, and Beat. He co-edited The Beatest State in the Union, an anthology of Beat Texas writings with Chuck Taylor and Rob Johnson, and Outrage, a protest anthology about injustice in a post 9/11 world, with Rosie Evelyn Lima, who is depicted here, correct? Behind us. Thank you to Luis Corpus, who will be speaking later today. He has also co-written Nuevas Voces Poéticas, a dialogue about new Chicanx poetics. Currently, he is working on 280 poems from the Twitterverse and a series of YA novellas entitled El Rinche, the Ghost Ranger of the Rio Grande. The first book in this series, out now, was a 2019 Texas Institute of Letters Best Young Adult Book finalist. And he is a member of the Refusing to Forget project, helping to bring the history of violence against Mexican Americans to the public, as well as the chair of the NACCS Tejas Poco Committee on Mexican American Studies in Texas schools. And also, he is, importantly, the interim director of Mexican American Studies here at UTRGV, and he teaches in the creative writing program at our university. And we are honored to have Christopher Carmona as our panelist.
To start my story here, it starts with my grandfather. So when I guess for me, I've always been a writer. I've always known that since I can remember. But for the past, I don't know how many years now, 8 or so years, I've been working on this these books on Rinches, right? So if you're all from here and we've heard the term Rinche before, some of you have, some of you, well, you should. But the term Rinche is really a term that refers to the Texas Rangers, primarily by the old Mexicanos of this area. And it really comes from the term Pinches Rinches, right? And that's where it comes from. That's what my grandfather used to call them. My dad called them Rinches, but my grandfather always called them those Pinches Rinches. But I would hear these stories about because he lived during this time. We're looking at a time of the early 20th century, from about I started in 1905, around 1910 to 1920, a time around here known as La Matanza, which led to the deaths of thousands of Mexican Americans. And a huge land grab by American corporations, American Anglo ranchers and such, sponsored by the state of Texas. They're using the Texas Ranger as their basic terroristic force to get a lot of the families to sell their lands in other ways. We're both, Cecilia's family is also part of this. We are too, because Mama Cavazos, so we are distantly related, I think. Yes.
Yeah,
we're
all.
So these stories that was always told. I grew up hearing these stories about lynchings and murder and all these different things. When I was like 8 years old, my grandfather told me the stories when he was drunk. And then as I got older, it wasn't really until I think it was a literary conference about a while back, 10 years ago or so, that I was talking to a graduate student in Chicano Studies at UCLA who'd never heard these stories. So I was like, that's crazy. I grew up with this. I thought this was all common knowledge. And I started looking in the history books and it's not in there. None of this is in there. So that's what started me on the journey to start to research these stories, and found that the recorded U.S. recorded history does not cover what happened here 100 years ago. That's when I started working with Sonia Hernandez and Trinidad González and all these other Refuse and Forget projects. But for me as a writer, I want to tell these stories to keep them alive because this is what I grew up with. But by the time at this time my grandfather was in his 90s, he had Alzheimer's, so I couldn't really re-interview him or interview him about these stories. So I always tell my students and everybody, record those stories that your grandparents tell you, because you have no idea how important those stories are. I had to go back and do a lot of oral history work, do a lot of different descendants, but to get the stories from my grandfather were impossible at that time. But I did a lot of this research on this side, and I put those stories into these novels. Right? The difference though was when I did a lot of historical research. But when I was going to write the first book, because this is a series of 4 books, when I did sign the contract, it was for 4 books, and then I realized I had to write 4 books. It was like, it sounds good until you realize how hard that is. So what happens is that the first book was the hardest to start writing because I didn't know how to write it. I'd read too much historical fiction that was basically, and no other way to say it's a white voice, right? And it wasn't until I saw Hamilton that kind of broke everything open. Because Erie's telling the story of America in a hip hop musical. And for me, it's like, you know what? I can do that in my own voice. And so I take these stories and I basically use my own voice. I use basically the music of my youth. I use corridos. That's the way these stories were preserved for over 100 years from Americo Paredes. All those people who wrote these. The corridos are how the people kept these stories alive and how we tell from person to person. So I utilize that. And I let go of everything that this book is supposed to be. That's how it's supposed to be written. And I just wrote it with my own voice. And that's what broke it open. It took me a long time to get there. But it's a hard thing because we're all trained that this is the way a book is supposed to be written. Then the hardest thing to do is to get my students to forget that. It's hard because we are reading all this literature and none of it is, very little of it is really representing our own voices. And so that's what we learned from. But I had to go back and listen to everybody who's telling me their stories. And just tell with your own voice. And it's really been, that has really been the one thing that has helped me through this process. So, writing in my own and doing that is hard to do. It's not easy. But you have to realize that history is not, the way we tell history is always mixed in with the way we bend reality. So none of it really has to work out like this. Has to be these details have to really be exactly as they were because nobody tells a story that way. So why do we have to do that? It's not as important as the story you're telling. And also I did this book as a superhero novel because there are about 5 Latino superheroes that most people know about. That's it. And so you're not seeing a positive influence out there. None of the Marvel movies have a superhero that is Latino. Right. There in the comic book world, there's a few: Miles Morales, Robbie Reyes, Jaime Reyes, and then Jessica Cruz is the Green Lantern. That's about it. Out of hundreds of them, right? So I wanted to give that to younger audiences, and it actually works really well because a lot of the younger kids really like this, and they're learning these stories, right? So that's my approach to writing. So. For me, it's I guess the question to kind of ask is, what is your story? and how do you want to tell it? And that's really the key that I've learned.
Kristen? Thank you. Our last panelist, but not least, is César L de León, a poet and author and UTRGV faculty member. César is the author of Speaking with Grackles by Soapberry Trees. He is one of 4 poet organizers for Poets Against Walls, a grassroots collective of poets and educators dedicated to centering and elevating work by borderland writers, artists, and activists affected by borders and divisions of all kinds. Other projects César has worked on include workshops and fundraisers with other writers and activists benefiting local communities in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas and elsewhere. His work has appeared in Queen's Mob Tea House, Pilgrimage, the Acentos Review, La Bloga, and the anthologies Pulse, Pulso, in remembrance of Orlando, Imanima, Poets Writing in the Anzalduan Borderlands, and Dreaming, a tribute to Selena Quintanilla Perez, among others. We're honored to have César today, and welcome.
I'm super honored to be here with everybody in the audience and the panelists. I'm a baby writer. I mean, I'm not a baby as I'm badass, but compared to everybody else, I'm just starting off. I have my first book, was just published this year, but I've been writing for a while and contributing to the body of writing, right? To the body of what is Latinx writing. And I'm originally from Monterrey. I was born in Monterrey. My parents and me and my sister migrated to Texas a very long time ago. I'm not gonna date myself. But yeah, we've been here we've grown up here. And when I mean here, I don't just mean the valley, but here as in the border, right? Because we cross back and forth, to visit family and back and forth. So the border has been my home. The Texas borderlands have been my home for a very long time. And that eventually trickles into my writing, right? I think the genesis of my writing, poetry, which is my genre at the moment, though I do have interest in writing other types of in other genres, right? But I mean, I started in high school, like I'm sure a lot of poets and writers, start, and I took comfort in it. I took comfort. To me, it was an escape, a way of dealing with what I would see around me. Even back then, I was writing like really angsty and like very, political poems, which were kind of ranty. And I think that has kind of followed me, right? I think I've gone through that process, right, of expressing like what I'm feeling. That's the genesis of a lot of my work, right? Just being to put into writing what I'm feeling at the moment. And then later on, as I've grown and learned, is that it's a lot of those little moments that Minusha, I think, Melissa mentioned that, right? Like the beauty and Luis also, right? Like the beauty of making tortillas, right? That is also who we are. And that is a way of establishing identity, right? Without saying, like how they say now, like, tell me you've done this without saying you've done this, right? Tell me you're from the border without telling me you're from the border. So that minutia, I think has become that form of protest that I had written before, right? Because as some of the panelists have said, that wasn't being written, right? Or that is being written for us. So, you know, us writing those moments that might not seem important, right? Becomes a way of protest, right? Becomes a way to record and leave as a history who we are. Some of the things that have been said by some of our other panelists, right? Like finding your own voice, that takes time. I think I'm still finding my own voice. So that takes time. One of the, I know Luis showed us his little notebook, and Chris and I were talking about like carrying our notebooks. But for me, I use my phone a lot. The notes app, I have like 300 notes. And some of it is just like a thought or a line or something that like triggers me, right? And it's like, you know what, like I need to write about this. Earlier in our conversation, I know Melissa mentioned Lynn and the chorizo factory there.
Chorizo forever.
And Lynn is known for, you know, it's chorizo. And it's like, man, that would make a great poem, right? Like
The chorizo life.
the chorizo life. So, and nobody else is going to write that, right? Nobody else is going to write that. So you might think that whatever you're writing is not important or it's trivial, but it's not. And we carry in us our histories, we carry our family on us. And Gloria and Salvador wrote, you know, I carry my home on my back, right, like turtles. And that eventually will trickle into your writing, right? If you're honest, if you keep that voice honest, that will eventually make its way through writing. There is a local poet, Stevie Luna, who has this beautiful poem, and I believe it's on YouTube, and it's called A Love Letter to the RGV. And it's just beautiful, and it is just filled of just these simple moments of writing a love letter to your home, right? And you might not think of that. You might think of writing these grandiose, you know, novels and poems. But when you really think about it, all those grandiose novels and poems are filled with these little moments, right? These very intimate details that really make it beautiful and unique, and speak of who we are. The collective that I belong to, Poets Against Walls, what our main goal is really to capture and to record and to kind of, yeah, I guess to record the voice of the area with our own voices, right? And for us, I know we're called Poets Against Walls, and our genesis was kind of brought upon by all this talk about border wall from the past, you know, I don't want to say the past 4 years because it's been going on for a lot longer than that, since, you know, Bush was president. But there's so many other walls that we need to break down. And poetry for us, I come from a school of thought that poetry is not just, you know, something that rhymes and something that is, you know, as we usually think of as a poem, but it could be a letter, right? It could be a testimonio, it could be a dream, right? And that is a poem. A photograph can be a poem. So what we do is seek out those stories, right? I think everybody has mentioned history, family histories. Those are all things that are that can be starting points for writing. That you just need to dig out, right? You just need to uncover, dust off, and dig into some of those stories. So, yeah. that's kind of my story, and I'm still developing and learning from people like everybody here, and of course people like Luis, who's been doing this for a while.
Thank you so much. I wanted to, now that everyone has had a chance to speak a little bit about their process and their work, I wanted to ask a question to all the panelists. And I also, before I do, I wanted to encourage everyone in the audience to please share any questions, any comments. This is a very open, casual forum. So if anybody has anything to say, feel free to raise your hand or just come up and visit with our virtual computer circle. And also, if you want to jot down ideas while we're talking, please do. So I just wanted to encourage, and anyone on Zoom, to include a comment or question in the chat, and we'll address it. I wanted to circle back what we've said so far to the theme of immigration. And one of the important priorities of this event is to discuss how, as writers and artists, we can cultivate understanding and compassion, and also speak about the invisibility and visibility of immigrant students, immigrant families, and about histories, the invisibility of history, of stories told, and the importance to tell stories into the future. And our students who are dreamers as they formulate their identity and want to do so without stereotypes and stigmas. I was wondering if we could connect in some way your work to the theme of immigration and this our interest in creating a community sense of place in this unique place in the Rio Grande Valley. And I was wondering if each of you, because you have this experience in different genres, could you maybe talk about these ideas in relation to your own genre? Why did you choose to work in this genre? Some of you work in multiple genres, of course, but what do you like about it? How does your genre help you express these ideas related to the border and immigration, if you want to go there? And also, I think it just would be important to talk about the genre that you all work in. If you could comment on that. Luis, do you want to start first? Or anybody else? Or, sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. If anybody
No, I'll talk. I always like to talk. No, that's a great question. It's a complicated question. I'm restless. I don't have a genre. It seems to be that I'm a novelist right now. Oh, wait, whoa! I'm so dizzy, man. So I'm a novelist now, but I think this is going to sound glib, but I don't mean it in that way. To me, writing is prayer. And I had a lot of mentors. I was really lucky. But one of my earliest mentors was Rodolfo Anaya from Burke, the great author of Bless Me Ultima and a lot of other books. In fact, the Library of America, this is a secret, is doing one of those big, beautiful hardcover memorial editions of his first 3 novels. And they've asked me to write the intro, which is kind of shocking. It's a little daunting. But when I was a kid and I was dealing with these issues that we're talking about, who tells our story? How do we tell our story? How do we face that invisibility thing? I mean, I had a rascuache little boyhood, man. Dirt Street in Tijuana. Came to San Diego because I had tuberculosis. I was dying of tuberculosis. And they finally thought, well, let's get out of Tijuana. And that's how I got to the barrio. It's like Tijuana light where I ended up. But I met Rudy when I was young and I was just burning with this stuff. And he said something to me that is one of my number one rules, and I will give it to you because it's from the master. It'll be in my introduction for his works. But he had been criticized in the Chicano movement of the time, which was very dialectical and so forth. And they took him to task for not being political enough in his work. And he did not buy that. And I asked him, so what do you say? What do you say to people? He actually said an expletive, which I won't repeat, but he said this, and it's been one of my main rules in everything I write. He said, if you can make your abuelita, wherever she is, for me in Tijuana, you can take your abuelita in Tijuana and through your art, make her the grandmother of a reader in Kansas or Nebraska or Missouri, someplace like that. He said, you have committed the most powerful political and spiritual act anyone can do. And it has stuck with me, you know. I really came away with this understanding that our story is sacred. And the invaders who came to these lands need your story to be invisible. And I'm just going to tell you that this is your land, you know, and this is a beautiful thing you have. It's very powerful. So when I say that for me, writing is prayer, I don't even mean it in church-going ways. It's a very active, you know, sweat-filled, painful sometimes journey against all odds. And I'll talk about this tomorrow, but just so you know, my first book was about people in Tijuana, poor people, suffering people, the people that, you know, the last president hated, the people the walls are for, pepenadores, you know, picking trash to survive and so forth. Many of them indigenous people. I spent years working with them. I'll tell you why tomorrow. And I wrote a book about it. My first book was a nonfiction book. But because I believed you have to write across the whole spectrum, my second book was a book of poetry, and my third book was a novel. And I try to keep that pattern going, the three things I love. Anyway, I wrote this book. It took 10 years of constant rejection to get that book published in the United States. 10 years, rejected for 10 years. One of the first editors in New York who saw it said to me, nobody cares about starving Mexicans. And I said, that's why I'm writing the book. What's the matter with you, man? I was also told nobody in the United States will read a book by somebody with a name as weird as yours. They told me, add an Anglo name. So I was just going by Luis Urrea back then, and I got all Mexicano. And I was like, I'll add Alberto, a ver si les gusta. I thought I was all revolutionary. Well, it turned out no les gustó. They didn't know my name got even weirder to them. But you know, you stick with it because you know you're carrying gold. And I would say the secret ultimately is that you're carrying grace, you're carrying gold, you're carrying your ancestors. You know, I always think about the hands of my ancestors. It goes back to the tortillas, but the hands of the working people that I love. That's the best I can do for now. So I'll be quiet because I want to hear what the panel has to say.
Anyone? I think we should be casual.
Okay,
I
let me
do-
flip you back, Luis.
Oh!
Sorry. Don't be afraid. This all worked yesterday in our dry run to have you up there. Figure out why.
Sound.
I'm very much a nonfiction writer. I don't see myself writing fiction probably in the future. My mom calls fiction mentira. Writing mentiras. I only see myself writing verdades. I'm very, you know, I'm formed as a journalist, I'm formed as an anthropologist, and I think that's really like the core for me. It's always the writing process is involved with human interaction and then writing. as an experience and as a reflection on that encounter with people. And I'm so, and eventually when I moved into what we call literary journalism or narrative journalism, this is kind of long stories that read like fiction, but they're based on reporting that you do on the ground, and you turn, you know, it has to read like it's like characters, and it has to have some conflict, some point of tension. And when I learned the story arc from creative writers like Luis, and I had the virtue of taking a writing workshop with Simon Cisneros, and then I read other narrative journalists, that arc of story that we find in movies and novels, I'm addicted to finding that in real life and to hanging out when I'm doing my reporting. Right now, I'm working on a story out of Stark County that I love. Best story I've ever worked on. I'm just gonna give you a little hint. There's mariachis involved, essentially. And I love, like, I just have to hang out, get to know people and get to know their stories. And then I'm like, oh, that's a scene. Oh, that's a point of tension. Oh, that's something that's at stake, you know? And so I work in this field of nonfiction. Sometimes I do personal essays or personal stories as well. On the immigration question, I would say, I relate to immigration because, like I said, my families, you know, have these long roots in the valley. I have a friend who jokes with us that are from here from a long time. He says, "Ustedes son bien sangrones." You guys are always like, "Show me the land grant." If someone says, "I'm a Ballí," show me the land grant. You know, prove to me that you were here in the 1700s. It can become a little bit of a kind of obnoxious nationalist discourse. You know, we're very rooted. But my parents, you know, my father's grandfather was from the U.S. I grew up in the Mercedes area. Then bought a rancho on the Mexican side. And in coming back to the U.S. side, my dad and my mom lived the experience of immigrants. And they became migrant farm workers for 10 years. I was actually, but the big secret is I was born in California because they happened to be there, you know, during harvest season when I was born, but we were living in Brownsville. So I relate to immigration personally, but I've also come to see and know that the reason we don't have a voice nationally and in Texas as Latinos, as Mexican Americans, is because we are perpetually only seen through this paradigm of the border and immigration, right? And so we're always, this is what I believe. You don't have to agree with me, but we're seen as perpetual outsiders. We're not even 3, 4, 5 generations in. We're not seen by the larger American, whatever, public audience imagination as Americans who have been racialized as different, as another. We're seen as perpetually foreign. And I think that's why we're invisible and we're silent, or we're silenced, right? And so the kind of stories that get written still every day about the border and how threatening it is, all the immigrants coming in, that directly affects even those of us who are generations removed from that immigration, as far as how we're seen. And so it's an ongoing project, not just to humanize and build compassion for immigrants, but to raise our voice and to show the complexity and the reality of the situation. That's what I try to do as a journalist. You know, my writing circulates in these mainstream media publications. And just to give you one example of a story I did years ago when the surge of migrants that we're seeing right here, right now, was happening in Southern Arizona. That's when Luis wrote his book about that period as well. There's one thing you do after today, after this gathering, is go by the Devil's Highway and read it. You won't be down. I think everybody here will agree. But I did a long story, and I connected with many times with migrants as they were headed to the border. And then one day I connected with them right as they had been returned, quote unquote, on the Mexican side. And they spent the entire day waiting to figure out what they were going to do. Do they go back home? Do they try to cross again? And they entered as a group into this really deep philosophical conversation and reflection about what the F had just happened to them, right? What they had just been through, why they had even come here. Was it, but what did they risk? You know, oh my gosh, I put my kid's life on the line. And it was this really, it gives me goosebumps to remember. It was a very deep conversation that was not simple. It was not black and white. And I feel like the stories in the media about migrants are often like they're coming for work, they're coming for a better life. Yes, they are. But they're deeper human beings from very complex environments that have to weigh, like all of us, a million factors, a million possible risks and decisions in order to make that journey work. And then every experience along that journey changes, you know, how you think about what you did and why you did it and what more you're willing to do. So that's what I try to do through my writing, is bring some of that to light.
Oh, I guess it's my turn. Okay, so with food, you know, it's just kind of another sneaky way to get a similar message through. You know, it's not. I mean, it can be a political story, but what aggravates me, you know, as a person that writes recipes, because you think, oh, that's kind of brainless. Well, yeah, but you know, there's always this us versus them sort of perspective. You know, if I said that I was writing Cajun recipes, people would say, oh, I get that. That's French mixed with indigenous and US, and I totally get it. And that is cool. But if you say that you're writing like about the border, and like you were from the border of Texas, and you know, you have enchiladas with iced tea and fried chicken and jalapenos, and you know, and they're like, whoa, what? You know, people, for some reason regarding the borderlands, it's always an us versus them proposition. It is never, you know, they're French Canadian, or the, you know, it's what Cecilia was saying. There seems to be somewhat of more of a black and white juxtaposition, and I see it in food. And so sometimes when I present a recipe, like say mole, it blows people's mind. You know, it blows my audience's mind. They're like, how are you coming up with this recipe that is from, you know, Oaxaca or Puebla or wherever it's from? I'm like, because it's of the Americas. Like, this is, hello, one continent. And just because we dovetail here in the valley, in the border, like nobody's business, because I mean, hello, this was part of Mexico for a while, and then we didn't jump the border jumped us, and we are still here. And so the Ballís were here, right? Some the Gabazos were here, or primos, you know, we've been here. One of the funniest stories I have is that the girls in my carpool are all the same. I wish I could tell you that I have like some unique story that my family has been here since, you know, the time of Spain, the time of Mexico, and then on through the time of Texas. But all of my friends in my carpool were the same story. And I agree with what Cecilia is saying. Sometimes people outside this area just can't conceptualize that. They can't conceptualize that the border was Spain, then Mexico, now it's Texas, and then it became the US. And it's just too much for people to process. So through my little kind of funny little approach to food, I try to re-emphasize that message, but coming through a different subject matter. I guess people maybe don't expect that through food, but there's all sorts of ways to say, you know, we are of the Americas, and we are one continent. And, you know, even though we have these political borders, we are one people that should be considered of one civilization. Does that make sense? But you can really more, I say it much more eloquently through food. I mean, it once you start seeing all of the story brought together on one plate, you're like, oh, I get it now. You know, it's not an us versus them proposition. I mean, you have the entire world on your plate. So anyway, that is my little different approach to it. So,
all right, so I'll tackle this one. The short story that kind of, I guess launched a lot of my work, because it came from well, before it was the first short story collection I had published. It was a short story called Strange Leaves, and it was at the time when there all these basically the huge influx of what they called unaccompanied minors were coming through here, and they established these massive respite centers in McAllen, Sacred Heart, and Immaculate Conception in Brownsville. And at the time, a friend of mine, she still is though, was the director of media for the Catholic Diocese, and so she invited me to go see the respite centers. So we went and talked to all these people coming through there, and the stories they told, right? And that's usually what we do is, right, just kind of collect all the stories. So I have a similar approach to Cecilia, where my stories come from stories I hear, stories I collect. So I have a very, I guess, a journalistic approach to it. But so that one, I used all those stories to create this one short story that I don't know why, but somebody told me to submit it to like the Texas Observer Short Story Contest. And it didn't win, but it got like republished so many times, and it became like this huge, it kept on getting reshared and through Texas Observer. And then even like the editor says, like, it didn't win, which gets the most traffic. And so with that one, that got me the book contract for the short story collection. But that story is about a young girl who is traveling through, to get here to the Rio Grande Valley, and her story as an immigrant is basically a compilation of a lot of the stories I heard from her. And that really took off nationally. That's the one story that still I get letters from people about that they read it. And a lot of it, the reason it's called Strange Leaves is there's something called, which is a horrible thing, called rape trees. I don't know if you've ever heard that. And they exist. Everybody asks me, are those real? Yes, they're real. It's basically what happens is the coyotes, when they're bringing these immigrants across, basically rape the girls and women. So it's like there's 100% chance this is going to happen, and the girls know this from the onset. And what they do is they put like their panties and stuff on these trees to kind of mark their territory. And there's trees like that all over the south, all over the border. Falfurdias area has a whole bunch of them. And so that's why the story is called Strange Leaves, which is also obviously a take on strange fruit. Yeah. But that is really like the connection to those stories. And, it's about a girl who does make it here, and she does, but those stories were back before, this is before Trump, right? The immigration policy in this country has been horrible. And these little kids, they were young 14-year-old kids treated horribly, right? So we look at immigration and the way we talk about how this goes into the work, it's something that it's always there. And so, even though this is like only, like we talk about immigrant stories, it's hard to talk about because on the border, it's been so fluid for so long. So we would always just go to Matamoros and Reynosa, and it was just like my aunt still goes pretty much on a daily basis. It's where they get their medication. So I remember I was talking to a New York Times reporter, and they were asking about that, like, do you guys, do they really go to Mexico to get the medications? Like, yeah, that's where we go. We get for dental treatment. That's where you went, and that still happens. And they were just so surprised by that. It was like because that didn't comprehend to someone from New York that you just cross the border and get your meds. It's so much cheaper. So things like that are just constant in our lives. And so if somebody points it out from outside, you realize that it's not normal. But for most people, it's not. For us, it's like we do it all the time. But that's when we talk about immigration. Those stories are just our stories. But the story is really about a changing, because the river has always been the river. Remember González Lewis Park? You used to be able to go across all the time. You can't do that anymore. Yeah, right. There was no there's the González Lewis Park sits both on the U.S. side and the Mexico side. You used to be able to just walk across the other side and back and forth, and nobody cared. Now you go and there's like border patrol all over the place. It's crazy. So it's really changed dramatically, even though the population shifts haven't really changed that much. Where most of the immigrants that are coming across are from Central America, and that's because of the problems the U.S. created in Central America that's causing the migrations. But when we look at the way we write and what's the influence of migration is, it's strange because my family, I think Cecilia's as well, hasn't really migrated that much. But we haven't, but we're still, because of the narratives that are placed on it, always. They're always eternally, foreigners. I think it's a good way to put it. But yeah.
So for me, as I mentioned earlier, I was born in Monterrey. came to the United States as a child back in the 70s, the mid to late 70s. And I mean, I'm very privileged and lucky and to have had a very different experience to what is happening right now, right? And that is just so jarring to see that before it was just so easy, you know, and it was difficult for some people, of course, but it was just a very different environment politically, and to see that played out in our backyards. Literally, we can drive 10, 15 minutes and see the border wall and see this heavily militarized section, right, where you are interrogated, you know, because you cannot even approach, you know, that area because you are, you know, they have you targeted through drones and all kinds of this virtual border that exists, right? So, you know, I remember growing up listening to stories of my family in Monterrey. And Monterrey is what, 250, 300 miles south, 400? It's a ways.
About 3 hours.
Yeah, it's about a 3-hour drive south, right? But I grew up listening to stories of my grandparents and my tios, like coming over to the US side, to the Piscas, right? And you know, my grandmother learned English, right, at the Piscas because they have schools for migrant workers, and that was like kind of normal. It was very fluid. Going, like Chris said, to go, you know, go have lunch at Progreso right across the border, or Reynosa, or Matamoros, go have lunch and then come back, buy stuff and come back. And that's just very, very different now. And just to see the horrors that are being, you know, perpetrated by Border Patrol and by policies, right, on these people that want to cross over, who are us, right? It's not these people, it's us, right? You see yourself. So the work that I do with Poets Against Walls, to connect everything back to writing and immigration, we like to work with local organizations. We work a lot with Lupe, which is La Unión del Pueblo Entero, which works with migrant communities, which offers services to immigrants and migrants, and we like to have workshops with them. I know Maria, she's here with us. She's participated in various workshops, and it really is to encourage everybody to write their own stories, to write, you know, I don't want to write somebody's story. I don't want to write their story. I don't want to write, you know, I could, right? I could fictionalize it. I could, you know, I think usted éramos unos mentirosos. Fiction, you know, and poets, of course, we're the biggest mentirosos. We turn the sky green if we need to. And you know, Chris also said, you know, you have to kind of twist it and give it like that appealingness. And it reminded me of something that was written by, you know, a white writer, Emily Dickinson, which was Tell the Truth, but Tell It Slaps, right? And yes, we have to do that a little bit, right? Like, darle sabor. Pero, you know, everybody should be writing their own stories. Even it doesn't have to be like this masterpiece, right? It could just be, as long as it's honest, and also giving the opportunity to others, right? If you are teachers, if you are writers, right, you should be encouraging others to tell their own stories as well, and helping them along. And that's what we want to do. There was a conference that I attended several years ago, and it was about it was concerning another collective, another South Texas writers collective. And we were talking about this was maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. We were talking about, you know, immigration and you know, telling the immigrant story and all this. And there was an audience member, and she said, well, you know, I work for for Customs and Border Patrol, right? And she's like, and she was making it seem as what we were saying was not the truth, that she knew the truth, right? And she said, well, basically she was saying that writers were twisting things, right? That she knew because she was on the inside, right? And so we asked her, we said, well, allow us to go in and have these people that you have in detention centers, allow us to go in and talk to them, right? And so they can write, right? And immediately the answer was no, right? Like, we're not allowed, right? So then it's like, well, que fregados, you know? You know, like just let them write, let them, however it comes out, si es un, you know, una carta or whatever it is, let them write, let them tell their own story. So that's kind of how I connect at least my writing, or I try to connect my writing with immigration by providing free workshops and community workshops, etc. Even if it's not to migrants, even if it's to us, you know. Like.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you say that, because yesterday I had lunch with Sister Norma Pimentel, who will be speaking tomorrow and participating in the artist workshop this afternoon, hopefully, if she has time. And she's the executive director of Catholic Charities and helps with one of the respite centers. And she said to me, she said, often people who have been through really difficult experiences, and she was referencing the children and the immigrants. She said often people who have been through traumatic experiences, they don't share them. And she said she's really excited to talk in this workshop, because she said art and stories, poetry, writing, it gives someone an opportunity to share. And I think that's something, that's an idea, a very powerful idea, going back to what Luis said and y'all have all said, that our story is sacred, and it's important to not be invisible and to share a story, a compilation, a poem, a work of art. And we have this beautiful pop-up exhibition of artworks that just kind of generated from organizing this conference that you see all around you in this room and downstairs in the hostel train installation. So I hope that we can harness the power of creativity and creating art, writing, sharing these stories that are sacred. And I thought this might be a nice time to talk about, well, first of all, I wanted to ask, does anybody have a question they wanted to ask any of the panelists? I didn't want anybody to fill on the spot. So, but we do have a question, outstanding, from one of my students, by the way.
Okay, go ahead.
So firstly, I wanted to say that often when it comes to different stories about immigration, I think it's a little bit unfair to say what the intention is of different groups that are involved in such works like that. And the reason I say that is because there have been scenarios like how you had pointed out, how there's such like rape trees and how that is a common occurrence now at this point. Mm-hmm. And so with that, there have been other stories about how, let's say, people not just from Central America, but from Asia coming into the Americas in order to get into the country. People from South America also doing the same. And I think that is stuff like that needs to be pointed out when you're having this type of conversation. With that, would you say that you are willing to change, for any of you, at least a small understanding of like why some people act a certain way when they disagree with you? Because I think it's become just a little bit too easy to disagree with with certain people's point of views simply because they might seem like they want none of these people to come in. Because of course, there's people who want to come across. They could definitely provide something good for the country. They could provide a lot of the culture, like how with you want to look into how food works and how it grows, and they could definitely bring that culture in, the stories that come across like that because of course we can learn about the experiences of how these people got here and such. So with that, would you be willing to say, I guess, compromise, what any of you be willing to compromise on the idea that maybe there is some sort of truth into why there is, I guess not really a benefit, but I guess a concern for the safety of the border itself? Like, would you be willing to compromise on any of those views that you have?
Well, for me as a journalist, I am forced, not forced, that's the wrong word, but it's my job to talk to different people and understand all the different sides. And so, for instance, that story I mentioned that I wrote out of Southern Arizona, the story interweaves my long day spent with the migrants with 2 long days spent with Border Patrol agents, and as they were doing their job. And so those 2 stories are woven together. And I did a lot of research recently on Latino voters and why we had a big surge of support for Donald Trump in the Valley. And I've been trying to understand what is this different viewpoint and where it comes from. And so I've come to really think more broadly that there is undue pressure on the border that has built up over the past 30 years, because it's easy to just say globalization, but we're having more and more movement of goods and money, and with that comes people. And that's happening all over the world. It's a trend that began a long time ago throughout the world. It builds up here, and we only, as a country, we only try to control it then at the border lines, right, at the border. This is where we manage it, stop it. And so we've seen a huge increase in violent crime on the border that I'm very sympathetic to. And that's why sometimes this discourse of border security now, that was a term that was made up by the government, but now it resonates a lot on the ground with people in the Valley who associated with medical violence on the other side of the border, and there's concerns about that. And so what I want to think about is not personally, not black and white conversations about immigration is good or bad, it should be allowed or it should be stopped, but instead to understand the kind of pressures that our home, our region is under because of these bigger forces and flows that are not being discussed and managed in other places. We're putting all the focus on the border. And so it's too much. Like, I feel like in some ways it makes border life collapse a bit. The thing that I find wonderful about the border is that I think it's very resilient and it always kind of comes back and finds a new form of being. But we are under a kind of pressure that's making it hard to live our own lives. And so I understand why there are people with different viewpoints in mind about whether immigration should or should not happen, or what we should do about it, how much do we control it. That's just my answer. I try to look at all the viewpoints and understand them from how someone else is making sense of the world, not how I am.
Great question.
I think I have a question.
Yes, sorry, I'm like processing that.
Well, first, Ian, if you know stories of crime and violence and stuff like that you think need to be told, you should write them. As everybody keeps saying, write your own story. But, well, not but, anyway, my point of view is different. And McAllen, Texas, the town I live in, is the safest place I've ever lived in my life. I mean, not just my personal experience. If you look at crime rates of all the cities in the United States, the towns on the border, most of them at least, have the lowest crime rate of almost anywhere. So a lot of this narrative about what a threat it is that people are massing on the border, trying to cross the border, is a false narrative, or at least it's very selected. Is being told, all right? It's a compilation of all, I mean, the mass media are always going to tell a story that's scary or exciting. The fact that most people are living their lives and that there is, compared to, well, I lived for many years in Dallas. In Dallas, I saw crimes practically every day taking place, some of them violent crimes. And my own property was vandalized and stolen and all over and over and over again. Dallas, at the time I was living there, was one of the most violent and crime-ridden places in the United States. It wasn't generally perceived that way due to very clever marketing by somebody, I guess. But I'm talking about looking at the FBI statistics and how much crime there is in everywhere. And compared to that, McAllen is practically a crime-free place. I mean, of course, there are crimes. There are lots of specific incidents, but the thesis that having immigrants here or having immigrants passing through here endangers our safety is largely a false one. And so keep that in mind.
I'm going to tackle the history of immigration in this country.
I'm sorry?
The history of immigration in this country is primarily, the first immigration law ever passed was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Right. And there's been several mass deportations in this country that are not based on safety. 1.8 million Mexican Americans were deported in 1931. 1954, I believe, was Operation Wetback. Another couple million Mexican Americans. Well, a lot of them were citizens were deported. A lot of this has to do with the politics and the racial and the racism within the country. So when we look at both sides of the story, yeah, of course. But you have to look at the history of these policies and where they come from. And 100 years ago, when the border violence was here, wasn't caused by immigrants that were here, but they labeled it as bandits, right? The Mexican Revolution. Well, it actually wasn't. It was the Texas Rangers who were doing we were killing thousands of people here. They're causing the violence. So when we start to look at multiple points of view when we talk about immigration wasn't even a crime until 1883. And then it wasn't until, I think, 1924 that it was anything but a misdemeanor to cross illegally across the border. That was it. Well, so and then within the past 30 years, the creation of all these, really the militarization of the Border Patrol, the creation of checkpoints, only came out in the 1980s. Why do we have a checkpoint that's 50 miles from the border? Right. You ever think about that? It's like, that's not a border. Well, we have that. And we talk to people in other parts of the country, they don't have checkpoints like that. They're not coming from Canada and have to stop at a checkpoint 50 miles from the border. What is that policy? Where is that coming from? Why do we have that? These are things you have to question, right? And so when we look at the immigration policies and things, there's a long history of racialized targeting in this country. And that is a fact. You can look up all these different things that are there. I mean, why do you exclude Chinese people? Because they're being successful on the West Coast when a lot of white basic people were not. And so they were trying to get rid of these people here. And guess who got caught up in that as well, sort of Mexican Americans. So it's very racialized. Remember, when we talk about immigration, it's always going to be a racial argument. No matter what anybody tells you, it always is. The numbers of deportations, you can look them up. 800,000 Mexicans are deported every year. You go to the next one, it's like 30,000. It's always been that. So why? Why such an extraordinarily, huge gap between the number of people being deported and who's being deported and why, right? And one of the arguments that's always brought up is what can they provide to this country? That is a rhetorical fallacy. Because that idea is like, well, what do you provide to this country? As someone who was just happened to be born on the side of the line, right? What is that? How does that define your meaning? So you got to think about these rhetorical questions. It's not your fault. This is what we're told. I mean, this is what we're told, and the media reproduces these narratives all the time. But when you actually learn the history of immigration in this country, the history of all these policies, then you got to see a different story. That's kind of what we do, we try to tell these stories from different perspectives. Like I'm saying, as someone who's not actually an immigrant for like 9 generations, right? But there is like these people who come across are villainized. They've always been. Even though these people, when you see them, if you go to a respite center, you can see the people coming. These are poor people who want a better life. The things that they go through to get here is insane, you know, but they're doing it because they want a better life. And that is a narrative that I always, because until you see this for real, it's not just like, when you see these people, how can you have any sort of humanity and not see what these people go through and hear their stories? They'll tell, I mean, there is a silence, but they'll talk to you and they'll tell you things and they know what's going to happen to them. And they do it anyway. That's one thing I learned from talking to a lot of
You know, and a lot of times, like just like I said, like going to the respite center, volunteering, listening to the stories. And I know I said like, well, you know, can we get them to write? It's like they are not interested in at that moment, like in writing anything, but just having somebody listening to them. And as Chris said, it really does go back. You know, there wouldn't be rate trees if the policies that are in place right now and that have been in place for a long time would be a little bit more humanitarian.
Just a quick anecdote. When I was with some doctors who work as psychologists who work with migrants along the trail from Central America here. And I was observing their work as a journalist, and they wanted to talk to some of the migrants in Central Mexico that were coming up from Central America. And one of the men was like, I promise you, he told the psychologist, I promise you when I get to my ending point, I'll look for someone, I'll go deal with it. Right now, I have to keep it together just to get through the end of this. And that was really interesting. It's like, that's not the moment for some people to be processing what they're going through. They gotta have the spine of steel to be able to get through it.
We have a question in the back.
Hi. Yeah. My name is Laura. I'm with the Texas Civil Rights Project. Thank you for being here. We've been monitoring Operation Lone Star very closely. And based on our monitoring, I'm really extremely concerned about another domestic terrorist. You know, the rhetoric, the white supremacist rhetoric in rural parts of Texas is steady, and it's increasing, and county officials are part and parcel of it, along with state. So my question for you is, where does the role of art writing play when the border is expanding beyond checkpoints, beyond the 100 points, the 100 miles? The county of Throckmorton, the northern part of Texas, is participating. No tiene nada que ver con la frontera, right? Can you talk a little bit about some of the work that can be done by people who live closer to the actual Mexico-Texas border, when we're actually the ones who will probably be targeted? You're being targeted by states.
I just have something real quick, just to go back to what Luis Alberto said, where you take your grandmother, his grandmother is abuelita that's in Tijuana, and you make that character appeal and equate the grandmother that's in Kansas or in Missouri. Like that's the job of the writer. So yeah, maybe art is you know, telling the truth with a slant, but it's a way to introduce compassion in a through storytelling, if that makes sense. Because I mean, I never really liked to listen to the really hardcore history or hardcore politics. I was looking at the food on my plate, but it was a way that, you know, telling the story on a slant it parallels and kind of softens the blow of reality by making it like a quasi-reality. I mean, even though they are all based on, I mean, a lot of us do creative nonfiction, but that's our job, is to make our subject matter get through to the people that have heretofore not listened. So, and I take the food route, which is a little weird, but I do what I can. So,
No,
yeah.
but you know, that's like, so you mentioned like the rhetoric, right? And the rhetoric, I think of white supremacy, even some of this, which is seeping into policy, is to dehumanize. And we don't just see it here, or we've seen it historically. When you want to dehumanize the target minority, the target group. And I think what art does, I think in all of our cases, is rehumanize, right? Talking about food, talking about like historias, the abuelita that connects with, it just rehumanizes that group. So that's what I mentioned earlier, like whatever minutia, right, you write about, or you know, history, it really is. I think the focus of our art is to say these people are human. These stories are real stories of real people. So I don't know if that answers, you know, your question.
Open-ended.
Yeah.
And then there's a simultaneous like political battle that many of us fight along our creative work, which is one thing is write the work, and then another is create spaces for it to be read and celebrated and disseminated in our communities and beyond our communities. And that's where, like, internally, I'm always having arguments with media editors about what stories they're running and who should be sent to write them. And Chris is really involved with bringing Mexican-American studies into the schools. And so, like, as artists, many of us have dual roles. One is do our creative work, another is create we call it in academia, political economy, sort of the, you know, the infrastructure, the places where that work gets centered and heard and read by more people, not just by us.
And I wanted to encourage our panel. I know we've talked about so many topics, but maybe I could encourage our panel to think about proposing a prompt for our student writers in the audience to take home and create some writing or some ideas, and we're going to have a way for y'all to share those with us on our website at the Center Left website. So would anybody, I know Chris and Cesar, y'all are, this is your forte, creating prompts. Do you want to kick it off, or do you have any ideas? I keep going back to what Cesar said about write a love letter to yourself. I think that's a really
I love this idea of the Twitter poem.
Wow. Yeah.
I know. I mean, it just sounds
Twitter.
like
Yes.
it sounds so amazing.
Yeah.
I can tell you all about that. So the first book, 140, was actually 140 poems, and like one poem every day for 140 days, which is a nightmare. As anybody who writes poetry knows, it is so hard to write short. So then, like the second one, which is the one I haven't published yet, 200. A friend of mine was like, you know, Twitter went up to 280 now.
Yeah.
It's like we should do 200 maybe. That was even worse. So like I think that what Cesar is has a good prompt there about what is your basically like to start the one I got from, I think it was Ana Castillo. You start off with I come from, and then you fill it in afterwards.
I think connecting identity and
Yeah.
self,
But also location.
and location.
Yeah.
There's a group, undocumented, documented artists and writers, and really I know there are a lot of times we focus on the suffering, right, of immigration and all this, but there's also joy. I think
Yeah.
there's moments of joy. I know Veronica Cardenas is a photographer who is a documentary photographer. You know, she's been on La Bestia, documenting the lives, and she realized, like, even in these dark and even in the worst moments, that there's moments of joy. And this group of undocumented artists, they have a series, or they have this project called Undocu Joy, right? So I think finding joy and finding these beautiful moments is a good starting point. I love the work that you do with food because I love my home too. Yes. But yeah, I do like the idea of writing a love letter to the place where you come from. And I'm totally stealing that from Stevie Luna. She watched that, like, Stevie, your poem is always amazing. But yeah, maybe write that love letter to your home or to your ancestral home.
I don't know if there's anything else that, like, one of you just wasn't, when we were talking, you thought of something in your life or somebody that's also like an inspiration to tell that story. You can also just write a story that comes from something that got touched in you today.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, why is there more emphasis now on immigration when back then it was just basically pure human nature? You know, the Africans traveled, you know, because that's where we supposedly began life, you know, and a lot of people immigrated, and animals as well, because we're also considered mammals. So why is there more emphasis now, not just on our country, but on different countries?
I can take that one. Because
Immigration.
humans are nomads. They just are. And, you know, the Bible speaks of the land of milk and honey. So that's when humans went from being nomads to farmers, because getting to that place where you could farm was always something that humans were always in search of. And of course, they would take their domesticated bees, their plants, all of that with them. But from what in my food studies, I mean, humans are nomads. And so, but now you're correct. There are borders which delineate law and tax rolls. And so now we're fenced in, but it goes against our nature because we're always looking to improve. This is what our minds do. This is what our human brains do, is we want a better place. And it's our nature to improve the lives of our children. That's just what we do. So that's my short answer. I don't know about anybody else's.
Or we're going to talk about why there's
The more emphasis, I mean, it's cyclical. It feels like there's more emphasis right now, and there is, because the numbers are high in the political moment in this country. But it's interesting when you delve into the history that Chris was talking about. Throughout the history of the border, there's been waves. It's kind of cyclical. There's been other periods where the discourse on immigration was very similar to now, where it had similar angles. So it comes and goes over time as well.
Yeah, and I just want to point out Luis Alberto in his book, The Devil's Highway, he said immigration is a white construct.
yeah.
And, anyway, did someone have a question in the back? Sorry, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Servando. I wanted just to make a quick comment that connects something with what you said, Chris, and what was your name? Laura said concerning white supremacy and what you've been saying about the breaches, which is a story with very deep roots and ramifications in this region. I immediately thought about when I was doing some of my field work in Central America, in Guatemala. I'm an anthropologist. On some evenings, people would gather around a small grainy TV set in Guatemala and watch Walker, Ranger of the Texas. And it was a weekly ritual. It was one of the only times I could get to watch TV, and that's what I would get to watch, with some Maya Indians of Guatemala. And they were always taken by this triumphant, resourceful, amazing Chuck Norris. And I would be just clenching my fists and walking back and forth and need to explain to them something about, number one, we don't call them rangers, they're pinches. Something about also the stories of the people where I come from here in South Texas. So I needed to kind of correct the impression of it from American media, which had a very long reach into Central America. The very people that have been affected by U.S. policy making the trek. So supremacy through its television diffusion has a very, very long reach. So I find myself needing to explain a character like Chuck Norris, who was of Native American descent in this series, is not viable. He had a African American partner, Ranger Trudette. That's very unrealistic. But these stories keep resurfacing. Just yesterday, I was in Walgreens getting a flu shot, and I see a series of photographic books that have been published regarding various local areas like Hidalgo County and neighbors, and there's one about Texas Rangers, which I knew it was a photo book, mainly based on captions, but there was virtually no mention. In fact, there was no mention of any injustices perpetrated by the Rangers. It was just a series of phrase captions, speculation, and adulatory statements. There was one quick little mention about Gregorio Cortez, but it was kind of dismissive, accused words, kind of way. Nothing about 1915 in Austin, Texas, where the Rangers were taken to task by the state. So we're reminded of what we can find if we're just attentive to the way that white supremacy continues to remain institutionalized and diffused and easily consumed by people who are least suspected.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we are out of time, unfortunately. I wish we had more time, but luckily we have lunch that the Center for Latin American Arts wants to provide a lunch right now at this time for an hour before we start our artist workshop at 2 o'clock. And I just wanted to encourage everyone here to submit a writing sample or a reflection. You can either submit it to our general email address, which is just CLAA@utrgv.edu, or we will have a place on our website under events. You see the poster for our event, and there'll be a link for to submit your prompts, because we'd love to continue these conversations. And as we said, this is just a primer paso, and we want to continue the conversations and give you feedback and stay in touch for hopefully future collaborations and future publications perhaps, and also just to continue these 2 days of events. And I look forward to us thinking about tackling binary relationships, rethinking stereotypes, resisting stereotypes, of course, and also finding beauty in the resilience of our culture and creating a sense of community as writers, students, teachers, friends, and colleagues. And I really appreciate everyone coming today. Please stick around and grab a lunch. Everything is separately bagged to provide some just safe service of food, and we have Chick-fil-A lunch. And we just would hope you could stay and visit with us and enjoy the day. Right, and visit with us, the panelists and organizers. We'd really love to get further conversations going over lunch. So welcome to the Center for Latin American Arts, and thank you so much for being here. And thanks to our panelists.